This video is going to be more of a refresher video than something that's like new functionality, but I figured it's important to put this in here because it does have similar functionality to what we've been talking about, which is underneath geometry ProxyPose. So for example, if you're just joining us for this video, we have a Dynamesh here. It's 763,000 polygons. And if I go in here and just say ProxyPose, it'll give us a new low res, kind of like an SD subdivision level 1 that I can now go through here and like mask a section, control tab to clear a mask, move your ProxyPose into position or inflate it or make any changes that you want to your envelope mesh, and then hop out of ProxyPose and your high-res mesh will follow regardless of if you have any subdivision history. You can use it with subdivision history or just on its own with just the functionality that I just showed you. However, let's hop back here and let's say in the old days of ZBrush before ProxyPose, but also something useful that you can put into your workflow is once you get your object to a certain point, and usually for me to know I've arrived at the point where it's like, hey, I'm ready to start detailing this in. You know, from back here, looks pretty detailed, right? It's like, oh, it's got little bumps on him, little skin detail. But then when you get in here, you realize, oh, okay, there's not a whole lot going on here. If I'm going to be doing something that isn't going to be breaking the silhouette, like if I go in here to BSH for snake hook brush, we'll go ahead and turn on tessellate or Sculptors Pro, I'm sorry. And if I turn on polyframe, you'll see what this is doing. This is just tessellating on the fly. So I can make, if I'm not doing any major changes like this, or, you know, this is still a Dynamesh mesh. So if you go down here to geometry Dynamesh, I can control drag to re-Dynamesh this, even go in here to my move brush here, and pull out a piece, you know. So if I'm really stressing the geometry and it's really, you know, doing weird bad things to the geo, I can always just re-Dynamesh and I got new geo there, right? If I'm not doing anything to stress my geometry anymore and he's pretty much dialed in, you know, I've had a lot of fun with Dynamesh and now I'm ready to take this to final, my next step would be to ZRemesh this to get me nice, two reasons. One is to give me kind of a more predictable geometry. Right now, this is, you know, a bunch of triangles. It's some quads, but a lot of triangles are in there that can be a little bit unpredictable when you're trying to sculpt like super fine skin detail type things. Another reason I might do it is to give me that, again, that low res envelope. So instead of having to go in here to ProxyPose, what I would have is a low res subdivision level 1 with subdivision level 2, 3, 4, 5 associated with that I could step through and make big pose changes or big low res changes that would propagate out to my high res detail. So again, previous to ProxyPose, this would be the only way to do that. Now that we have ProxyPose, you can use this technique I'm about to show you in conjunction with ProxyPose if you'd like. So we have an object here. There's a couple different ways you can go about getting this detail to a low-res proxy mesh or a sub-D level 1. I'm going to show you my preferred method, and then I'll show you another method. So my preferred method is to go up here to your undo slider, hold down Control, and just tap this point you're at in history. That's going to store all of the verts in this object into history. That'll also include any poly paint you might have. I don't have any poly paint there, but you can project, now that we've stored those in history, we can project the details, the geometry, vertex positions, and the color to any new geometry you might want to make. So speaking of new geometry, since we've stored those points in history, I can now, on this subtool, go down here to ZRemesher. Sorry, underneath geometry, ZRemesher. There's a lot of options in here, and in fact, you can even use Polygroups and poly paint to go through here and determine your polygon density as well as your edge loop control. I'm not going to go into that, but I will post a few videos here that talk about that, how you can make your own polygroups to really control your edge loops, and of course the basics of ZRemesher here. I'm not going to go into it again, but you can go check those videos out. Just check the description to this video. So we have X symmetry turned on. I'm going to go over here to ZRemesher. Let's say target polygon count of maybe 10,000 polygons. Adaptive size I'm going to bring down quite a bit. If you go down to 0, it's going to make everything nice, even quads. I do have some tiny teeth and a little tongue built in here. So in this case, what I might do is bring that adaptive size up. That'll take any major edge changes into consideration, so it'll give me a little more geometry in those little areas so I can capture those teeth a little bit better. So I'm going to say, okay, I've dialed in those settings. I'm going to hit ZRemesher. And in 2021, in first iteration of 2023, they actually have this retry button. So once you get your result, you can go through here and change your settings and then retry from your original mesh. This is actually pretty good. You can see it went through and gave me nice even quads. If you want to try your luck, you can go down here and say maybe half and then ZRemesh this again. Again, we have X symmetry turned on, so we are having a symmetrical object. The detail in this area is actually okay. I'm getting a little concerned about the mouth area because we lost so much detail in those teeth. It's probably not going to project those teeth back very well. So I'm going to undo that. I think this will be fine. You can see this is the active points. It's way lower than 700,000, right? So now we're down to 21,000. I think this is okay for our initial sub D level 1. So let's go ahead and start getting our detail back. But as you can see, we got some secondary forms in here, like little bumps and teeth and stuff like that, but we lost all our skin detail and all of our little bumps, right? So let's get those back. So if we go over here to geometry, you're going to see there's a divide option. So right now we have these lower res verts, and then we have our high res verts stored in history. In fact, we can actually go back to our history slider and go and look at them and be like, okay, yeah, there they are. And then we can go forward in history to this one. And then this is our new low res mesh. So what I can do, and what I like to do, is go over here to Subtool, Project, and do Project History. And again, with geometry and color turned on, it'll project any vertex position and any vertex color that those verts hold. It's going to project them. Now, this is a projection. When we talk about ProxyPose, that's not doing a projection. That is setting up a relationship between your low-res proxy mesh and the high-res mesh. There's no projecting going on. It's literally, here's these high-res verts, and I'm going to give you a low-res envelope that's going to control those high-res verts. We're going to do that. That's what we're essentially setting up right now. But just realize, in order for us to do that with this method, with ZRemesh and Project, we have to use a projection method to get our details and color back so that we can have that ProxyPose relationship. So we've done Project History, and that's projected our low-res verts out or in, depending on which direction the rays are finding the nearest geometry to get our mesh. And then we're going to hit Control D to subdivide, or just hit divide right here. And then this is going to average your vertices. You see my verts kind of melted a little bit. If you don't like that, you can turn off SMT temporarily, hit divide. That'll give you more geometry, but keep those verts in their position. And then you can go back up here to Project History. At this point, it's usually pretty safe to turn Smooth modifier back on. So you can see we're starting to get a little bit of detail back. If I hit Control D one more time and then say Project History, there we go. So now we're up to 350,000 points, and we're getting our detail back, and we now have subdivision history. So just like ProxyPose, we now have a low version of our object that we can now go through here and make like a mask selection here, and then you can control tap the blur. It'll be very responsive. You can go through here and you can pose this, and as you move this envelope, this low res envelope around, you can go back up to subdivision level 3 and all of your high res details follow, essentially giving you the exact same usefulness out of ProxyPose. You can do it with this method. What you have to do though is go through the step of projecting history, which you may think, well, this doesn't seem that bad. Where it gets a little bit squirrely is if we go through here, subdivision level 3, sometimes, you know, like this, your geometry and your teeth aren't quite matching up. Sometimes you'll even get some really bad projection errors. This one turned out pretty well because I kept it fairly high res. Just to show you how bad it can get though, I'm going to go back here to where we had our original ZRemesh. I'm going to do a half here. So ZRemesh half, and then we'll go ahead and say, okay, now I'm going to project history, Control D, project history, Control D, project history, Control D. So now our lowest res version is very, very low. Nice. And the other cool thing about having a low res geometry assigned to higher res geometry is I would never try to go in and UV map 691,000 polygons, right? But because I have a sub D level 1, I can now go in here to Z plugin, go over here to UV master, say we have symmetry on. Polygroups I don't think we have, but that's okay. We can just literally just say work on clone, unwrap, let it do its thing. Or you can, you know, UV in any program you'd like, and there's other UV options. If you watch the other 2023 videos, there are new UV map. You can crease unwrap in here. A lot of interesting, cool ways to go through an UV map. But you can see I now have UVs on this thing. I can now copy the UVs from this mesh, go back to my working mesh here with my subdivision level. I can say paste UVs. So now instead of having to UV 691,000, I can UV the sub D level 1, go down here to texture map, create new from UV check, and you can see I've transferred my UVs. So now I have a 691,000 point high res with UVs. So it's a very, very useful for that as well, as far as having subdivision history. But we'll go ahead and turn the off colorize, and we'll talk about projection errors. So if I go here, and let's go ahead and turn off our texture map here. So we now have subdivision history, and as we go over our model, you'll see, oh, it didn't quite grab all of the spikes here. My teeth have a few issues here. We can actually fix these. There's a couple different ways to fix these. The easiest way to fix these is so we have our object here. We still have those original points stored in history. So what we can do is on this one, we can go to BHR, which is your history recall brush. It's not going to work with X symmetry. I'll tell you how you can, just do, since this is a symmetrical mesh, you can fix one side and then mirror your fixes over. So hit X to go out of X symmetry. And now we can use the history recall brush to pull or push these verts. It'll do either one, depending on whether or not, I'm just going to do this real quick. I'm going to go in here with my clay brush, and I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to push these verts down, and then I'm going to go over here and push these verts. Let's find a more interesting spot with more detail here. Let's go over here to this arm. So on this arm, for example, and I'm going to do another project history just to make sure we've got all of our details projected. There we go. So for example, I've got all this arm detail, right? Well, let's say you had a projection error where it didn't quite grab far enough in that direction, then maybe you have another projection error where it didn't project down far enough. Well, again, you can fix this. Turn off X symmetry, go in here to BHR, history recall. It's going to look at these verts where we have our new mesh, and then we can just, all you got to do is brush over this. It's camera dependent, so you don't want to put your camera here and brush it back because it's going to smush all the geometry in that direction. Just find a nice down view of this and just brush over with this brush. It'll push it right back down onto the original verts. And same thing for this one. I don't even have to hold down Alt or anything. With history recall, it'll know that, hey, these verts need to come up to this one because in history you have these verts stored. So it'll go ahead and fix that for you. Same thing for this one over here. So you can go through on one side of your model. I tend to work, if I'm going to fix some stuff, you can hold on Shift to smooth and then go back in here. So Shift to smooth and then project, Shift to smooth and then project, just very carefully working around your object. Once you've fixed one side on a symmetrical mesh, you can go in here to deformation. There is a more smart resim. So you can hold down Control, let's go back here to mask pen, Control mask over the good half, the half that you've fixed, and then hit smart resim across the X-axis. That'll take these fixes, resim them over to the side, tap X to go back into X symmetry, and now you've projected, you've done your projection fixes, you've mirrored it, and now you have subdivision history. So you get a subdivision level 1 envelope, 2, 3, 4. Like we talked about with ProxyPose, however, you can't go down to subdivision level 1 and make vertex changes. If you try to go through here and say Control Shift slice and change vertex order, or go in here with your Z modeler brush and try to like insert an edge loop, it won't let you. Anything that's going to change the vert order, it won't let you do, because again, this low res vert has a relationship with every single subdivision above it. Now, having said that, there are caveats. So let's say, we love this because we can go through here now and we can start doing our really high res, high fidelity sculpting and go through here and get our skin details and start working on this. But if we still want to make a major change, we can go back down to subdivision level 1 or subdivision level 2, use big move brushes, use big sculpting brushes, and then get our detail back by going back up to subdivision level 4. However, if we want to do a really big change, like, BSH, another thing you can't do is you can't use Sculptris Pro. So if you go through here and say, I want to Sculptris Pro this out, it's not going to let you. It's going to say, hey, that will change the vertex order, that changes the relationship this vert has with these new verts, these higher res verts that you have. We can't do that. You can't make any vertex order changes. You can't cut in any new geometry with this caveat. So what you can do, though, is you can say, I want to change the low res geometry. Well, if you're on subdivision level 4, you can say freeze subdivision levels. And what that'll allow you to do is it temporarily freezes your high res geometry. And now you can go in here and say, hey, I want to go through here and say insert single edge loop, or I want to go through here and say, slice through a mesh. Or you can even do stuff like this where I hold down Control, hit Control W to make a polygroup. So let's make that more obvious here. Hit B. Let's go into our comma key. Let's go in here to brush. Let's go in here to insert IMM, dragon bones. And this is a fun little piece of functionality. I'm going to hit M on my keyboard. M as in Michael. Grab this horns. And this horn geo has a hole on the back. So what that means is if I pull on here, any geometry that has a hole on the back that you pull onto a polygroup, it will allow you to position this, control drag again, and it will do a, what's that called, a mesh fusion. So it'll actually take this open hole down to your polygroup open hole and mush these together. I'm going to go ahead and just hold down shift to kind of smooth this transition out a little bit because it's a little bit tight here, and then we'll go back in. You know, it's fine. I've got a horn coming out of his shoulder. I don't really care what it looks like that much. I just want you to know that you can make pretty drastic changes to your geometry while it's frozen. However, what it's going to do next is going to be probably expected. We need to reset up the relationships from this geometry, this new change geometry, to our high res. How it does that is if I go out of freeze subdivision levels, it's going to essentially mask out any of the areas that you changed and re-grab your high res and project those details back. And it's just going to subdivide whatever you had there. So if you had very specific ideas about how this horn should have looked, this is probably not the way to go about it. But if you just want to add some real quick extra geo to your sub D level 1 and then get your high res back, it's a pretty decent way to go about it. All you got to do is unmask, go through here, clean this up a little bit, and you're good to go. Now, remember, another option available to you is if you did want to go through here and say, hey, you know what? I need to make some major changes and I don't want to have to deal with my lowers anymore. You can literally go in here and say delete lower. Now you don't have any subdivision level history. You can say BSH, say go to Snakehook Brush, go in here to your Sculptures Pro. You can change this geometry however you want. So if you want to make any big sweeping changes that's going to really tax your geometry, feel free to absolutely do that. And then all you have to do is go back in and do the process again. Just go through and ZRemesh again. There's other alternatives too if you don't like ZRemeshing, or you can use ZRemesh in conjunction with like GoZ to put this, or exporting your ZRemesh, going out of ZBrush and changing the topology, importing it back in, reprojecting the detail. But at that point, what you're relying on is your ability to create new geometry and then subdivide and project, subdivide, project, subdivide, project, in order to rebuild the relationship between your low-res envelope and your high-res geometry. But of course, once you've done that, there's a lot of really cool things you can do now with subdivision history and really cool reasons, of course, to go that route as opposed to ProxyPose. And of course, you can do, another good reason to do this is if we go, let's go in here to Load Tool. We have this one here. So for example, if I wanted to use Transpose Master, and I've talked about this in the previous videos, but I want to bring it up here too. Another good reason to have subdivision level, subdivision history and all these, and I have it on every single object on here. So instead of using ProxyPose, I can go through here and say, hey, ZRemesh or low res, or in this case, it's actually a projected mesh. You can see the ears still in there and extra fingers. This is a projected mesh from 1024 scan data model. But we can go through here and we can say, hey, give me a new subdivision level 1 and then reproject my details. I would do this for every single object in here. So now if I want to use something like Transpose Master, I can say, hey, Transpose Mesh, boop, hit that button. That'll drop every single subtool to its lowest, merge it all together, and now I have a 60,000 polygon mesh. I can go through here and just do very, very quick, easy pose changes. Like, I mean, not even just pose changes, but also going through here and be like, hey, I want to do overall proportional changes. So I'm going to get rid of, you know, these. Let's do this. Let's say I want to just get the shell out of the way. You don't have to bring everything over. You can leave visibility off and it won't bring your shell over if you wanted to avoid that. But for example, if I wanted to go through here and be like, you know what, I want to make both of his wrists a little bigger, you know, and I don't want to have to remove all of the subtools around it. Well, just transpose mesh here and you can go through and make his wrists and his ankles fatter. You know, maybe we're doing for a stylized reason, you know, I don't know, doing whatever you want basically. The ability to go through and move multiple subtools at the same time at their low res that's not even a proxy, at their sub D level 1, and then say, okay, we've made all the changes that we want, or posing. So if we want to go through here and say, just like in the previous videos, I want to go through here and pose and then control tap and then invert and then set this here and rotate his arms in or whatever. We can now say, okay, we're good to go. I'm going to say Transpose Master T-pose to sub T. That'll take all of the meshes, push them back over to the subtools here. It's just re-updating them. It's basically taking the low res that you've changed, updating those low res verts to their new vert positions, and then of course the high res verts will come along with. Actually, it doesn't look too bad. I actually I like that. So now we have a new version of this character posed or whatever, but we still have all those relationships. Subdivision level 1 was changed and then propagated out back out the details of subdivision level 4. Of course, at this point, you can now go through here and alt tap this subtool, because now we're back in multiple subtools land. We're not in transpose mesh anymore. So now we can go through here and say, hey, let me alt tap this one and move these things around or move them in or whatever on an individual subtool basis. But or if I wanted to go through here and start posing as opposed to being all together, I can say, hey, subdivision level 1, go into solo mode, maybe make a finger selection here, invert that, and we'll say go down here and we'll say rotate this in and then mask this and then rotate this in and then mask this. And then, so if you want to do like finger poses, totally doable, just to kind of pose them out separately like that, and you're good to go. So anyway, I just wanted to bring up the fact that you can use ProxyPose in conjunction with this, like we've talked about before, and you can also set up those subdivision level 1 relationships with your high res for all sorts of reasons you might want to do that as an alternative or in conjunction with ProxyPose. Now there is one more thing I did want to bring up. So for example, when we went down here to project, we had project history, which is my preferred method because you can project in and out at the same time. There is a project all option though. So if we let's go ahead and just delete all out of here. If we go back to our working mesh here, I'm going to go back here to our original high res here. So let's say on this one we have, I'm going to go through here and just insert some spheres on here. So let's say we had a bunch of different subtools. So here's a subtool, and then here's a subtool, and then here's a subtool. And in fact, let's go ahead and say, I'm going to split those subtools off. And then this one here, I'm going to say U, split hidden, and then U, split hidden. So now we have this mesh here along with other visible subtools. Go ahead and turn off polypaint. So we have a body mesh and then a bunch of other subtools in here that are making up some sort of parts of the high res, but they're not part of the high res subtool. They're just ancillary subtools underneath, right? So you've got the body, and then maybe you've got some other stuff, and you want to make a high res or a low res envelope for everything you see on your screen. If you wanted to use project history, what you'd have to do is go down here to like merge visible, or you could do like a Boolean mesh. Basically, you can go in here to like Boolean, turn on live Boolean, say make Boolean mesh. That'll put out either a merge visible if you went that route, or a U mesh out here. You can append it back in, or you don't even have to append it. Well, let me just do it. Okay, we're gonna put all these things together. So we're gonna just say subtool Boolean, make Boolean mesh. Give it a second to Boolean, or again, you could go down here and say merge visible, and then here's all your merged subtools here. This one, these things are still separate objects. On our U mesh here, our Boolean mesh, these are all sewn in. They're not separate objects. Either way you want to go, now you can say, okay, these are my new vert orders. I'm going to hold down Control and tap here, and then we can go back to our original working mesh. And then I would still need an overall envelope for this. So in this case, what I might do is just append that U mesh here. And then with that U mesh selected, I'm going to go ahead and hide all of these here. And then I can just say, you know what, another way to get an envelope, we can go ahead and ZRemesh this U mesh. It's fine because it's all vert welded. So we could say, you know what, depth size down, target polygon count up, X symmetry is turned on. And this will go ahead and give us a ZRemesh with this stuff built in. Let's give that a second to finish. Oops, looks like I didn't have X symmetry turned on. That's okay. So essentially what we have is these points stored in history on our U mesh that we just control tapped, and that's why this is red. It's telling us we have points stored in history, but it's not part of our working tool. That's totally okay. We have our U mesh that's been ZRemeshed. We can now go through here and say, let's do it here, project history to get those points back, or to project to those points, Control D to subdivide, project history, Control D to subdivide, project history. So that's one option. You can also, if we delete this out of here and then we append back in, instead of appending the U mesh, we'll append in the merged version. Another way to get an envelope besides Boolean is to simply go through here and just say, we'll do it in this menu here so you know where it is, geometry Dynamesh. So Dynamesh will create an envelope too, and we can, crank up the resolution. We can actually drag from the resolution slider onto our mesh, and that'll dial in the resolution we need. We'll turn on Dynamesh, and that will weld all of these points together, so now it's all one envelope. And in fact, if you want to go through here with your resolution and crank that down a little bit, and then control drag, let's crank that down a little more, control drag, what you're essentially doing is voxelizing an envelope that's pretty low res. It's grabbing all the details you may or may not need, or you probably need, creating an airtight mesh, hopefully, and then you can go through and ZRemesh this. So again, we got symmetry turned on. We're going to say ZRemesh depth size down to 11, target polygon count to whatever, and then we'll go ahead and ZRemesh this. So instead of using a Boolean, we can merge, append, Dynamesh, ZRemesh, go through here, project history, Control D, project history, Control D, project history, and get all that back. That was a long, rambling way to go about what I'm trying to get at here, which is what we were originally going to talk about. Let's turn on all of these back on. So what you can do instead of projecting history, if you want to get rid of those stored points, just Control tap the latest point in history for any subtool and then Control tap it again. You can now go down here to so again, we have all these objects, right? If we go down here to merge visible, and then it just did a merged version, then we can go in here to append that merged version. Again, we want to create an envelope, right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn on X symmetry, go in here, make it the same resolution, turn off blur, Dynamesh. So now we have our envelope of our geometry here. I'm going to go into solo mode. So this is all just an envelope of geometry, all vert welded. And then we have our original high res is here, 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 and here. So instead of using project history, what I can do is select this one. Let's go ahead and say ZRemesh, again, target polygon count to whatever, adapt the size down just a bit. And we're going to turn this Dynamesh envelope merged version into a ZRemeshed, nicer geometry version that has all the silhouette changes that we need, because we went through and voxelized it. So okay, here's our new merged, voxelized, or Dynameshed, ZRemeshed version, and we have all these other subtools showing. So now instead of going down here to project history, we don't even have a project history option because we got rid of those stored points. We can now do project all. Project all will project to any visible subtool we have in our scene. So we go through here and say project all, and then hit Control D to subdivide, project all, Control D, and you can actually go in here to solo mode. So you can Control D to subdivide and then project all and watch your mesh update without having the original meshes in the way. And then once you're done with that, if you ever want to, for example, on this one, if we went through and did our thing again where we say, okay, this didn't project right and this didn't project right. Now, instead of using history project, we don't have any history anymore. So we're going to go in here to BZ, and then Z project brush, BZP. That will give you a Z project brush. Now, it's different than Z history recall brush because we have a Z sub and a Z add with this one. So by default, it's set to Z sub, which means if I go over, let's go out of solo mode. You can't be in solo mode with this brush because it needs to be able to see the other objects. So on this one with Z add or Z sub with our Z project brush, and this will also do RGB and geometry information. So if you had a poly paint on our original, we could Z project back that RGB information from our verts. But for this one, Z sub will push geometry back. So I'm going to push this back. And again, it's camera based. So again, you don't want to go to the side and do this because it's going to squish your geometry in that direction. So again, go from the top, and I'm going to go through here and project this high-res geometry, new high-res geometry to my original high-res geometry. However, you see when I go over here, it doesn't do a Z add or project back up. It just ignores it, right? So in order to get those, you need to switch over to Z add, or while you're doing this, just hold down Shift. Wait, that's smooth. Hold down Alt. Sorry, Alt will switch. It doesn't show it doing it, but if this is set to Z sub by default, holding down Alt will switch it to Z add, and then you can just go over here and brush this back. So you don't need to change it to Z add. You can leave it on Z sub. Just hold down Alt, and that'll pull up, and then let go of Alt, and that'll push down to any details that you have. So instead of project history, that's project all. And then once you've done that and you're pretty happy with the result, you can go in here and say, hey, I don't need this stuff anymore. You can just delete, 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 delete. And now we have this version here with subdivision level 1, 2, and 3. We use project all instead of project history, but it's the same thing. End result's the same thing. But again, that's just another alternative and or use in conjunction with ProxyPose.